Vladimir Putin's greatest weakness has just been exposed. It's not a tank and it's not a missile. It's Kaliningrad, the Russian territory wedged between Poland and Lithuania, now collapsing from within. Moscow's propaganda calls it a strategic asset. But the truth is, NATO has just revealed the opposite. The enclave is isolated, in crisis, and becoming more European than Russian. The danger for Putin isn't an invasion, it's economic collapse, internal discontent, and the growing fear of losing control. Kaliningrad has always been sold as Russia's clenched fist in the heart of Europe. An enclave armed to the teeth, built to remind NATO that Moscow can still strike any European capital within minutes. It's home to Iskander-M ballistic missiles with a range of up to 500 kilometers, capable of carrying nuclear warheads. From there, those systems can reach Warsaw, Berlin, and even Copenhagen in just a few minutes. The territory also hosts S-400 Triumph air defense batteries, one of Russia's most advanced systems, covering nearly the entire Baltic region, along with naval bases housing corvettes equipped with Kaliber missiles, the same type used in attacks against Ukraine. On paper, it's a modern fortress, a Russian outpost, surrounded by enemies yet ready to strike back. And that's exactly the image the Kremlin works hard to project. On RT and RIA Novosti broadcasts, Russian officials describe Kaliningrad as the Western Wall of Russia, an impenetrable shield against NATO aggression. During military parades, cameras capture tanks rolling through Kaliningrad's streets, while commentators praise Moscow's power and the pride of the Russian people living on the front line. But the truth is, this fortress isn't as solid as it seems. When the facade of strength begins to crack, the tone changes. What was once a display of power now sounds like the echo of a cornered regime. Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, has become the voice of that desperation. In his recent appearances, he's abandoned the cold, calculated tone of diplomacy and started speaking like a man trying to convince his own people that control still exists. In one of his most striking statements, Lavrov accused the West of waging a total hybrid war against Russia, claiming that all lines have been crossed and that Europe has declared war on our country. Words that, in any other context, would sound threatening. But today, they come across as an admission of weakness. Since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the Kremlin built a narrative of confidence, selling the idea that Russia's advance was inevitable. But as sanctions began to suffocate the economy and battlefield defeats multiplied, that narrative of power turned into rhetoric driven by fear. Moscow went from aggressor to victim, and the entire world became the enemy. It was the first sign that Russian self-assurance was morphing into paranoia. Russia has been using what it calls the victim syndrome as a political shield. It's the idea that the country is being persecuted, surrounded, and forced to defend itself. That narrative justifies everything: the invasions, the attacks, even the international isolation. State propaganda repeats every day that NATO is the one threatening peace, that the United States is the real aggressor, and that Moscow is merely reacting to Western hostility. It's a complete inversion of reality, but one that still resonates with part of the Russian population, kept in line by fear and censorship. Analyst Artem Dekharev described it with surgical precision. Russia has a desperate need to play the victim. It's the only role that still convinces part of the population that there's a noble cause in this war. That sentence captures the core of the problem. A country that must portray itself as a victim to justify its actions isn't showing strength, it's showing insecurity. And that insecurity is growing as the noose around Kaliningrad tightens. Kaliningrad, once a symbol of Russian military power, has now become a mirror of collapse, isolated, weakened, and drifting farther from the illusion of an impenetrable fortress that Moscow tries to sustain. Propaganda can deceive the public for a while, but it can't change the facts. And what's about to happen in Kaliningrad may prove that the war Putin fears the most isn't against NATO, but against the very system he created. While Moscow plays the victim before the world, NATO is doing the exact opposite, acting quietly but with precision. What the Kremlin calls aggressive expansion is, in reality, the direct result of its own choices. Every invasion, every threat, every speech by Lavrov has come at a cost, and that cost has been the West moving ever closer to Russia's borders. Over the past 15 years, Europe's map has changed before Putin's eyes. Since 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, NATO has stopped being a distant alliance and started acting as a living wall, advancing over what Moscow once considered its sphere of influence. Countries that previously maintained a neutral stance began to see the truth. Security doesn't come from negotiating with the Kremlin. It comes from protecting themselves against it. The invasion of Georgia in 2008 was the first warning. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 confirmed the pattern, and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was the point of no return. In just 1 year, Finland and Sweden, historically neutral nations, broke with decades of tradition and joined NATO, a strategic move that completely reshaped Northern Europe's security map. Now, look at Kaliningrad. The Russian enclave that once served as a power base is now surrounded on all sides. To the north and west, Lithuania and Poland, both NATO members. To the south, the Suwalki Gap, the narrow corridor between Kaliningrad and Belarus, permanently monitored by Allied forces. And to the east, the Baltic Sea, once dominated by Russia's fleet, now practically a NATO lake, dotted with air and naval bases stretching from Estonia to Norway. The annual military exercises held in Poland and the Baltic states make it clear. Abrams, Leopard, and Challenger tanks maneuver together. F-35 fighters patrol the skies, and infantry units train for siege and blockade operations, precisely the kind of scenario that would leave Kaliningrad completely isolated in the event of conflict. U.S. Army General Chris Donahue, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, put it bluntly: if war breaks out, NATO is capable of taking Kaliningrad in record time. A statement that echoed through Moscow like a warning, and a reminder that Putin's so-called strategic asset could turn into a deadly trap. The enclave that for decades symbolized Russia's military reach in the heart of Europe has now become a vulnerable pocket, cut off from mainland Russia, dependent on supply routes that could be severed within hours. And the most ironic part is that this encirclement wasn't built by NATO through force. It was provoked by Moscow itself. Every step Russia has taken toward war has only tightened the noose around its own neck. NATO didn't need to invade, it simply reacted. The result is that today, Kaliningrad is no longer an outpost. It's an island surrounded by enemies with no strategic depth, no escape, and none of the strength the Kremlin still pretends to have. And that reality, that creeping sense that Russia could lose what it once considered untouchable, is fueling new tension in Moscow. Because when national pride turns into military vulnerability, collapse stops being a possibility and becomes a matter of time. Behind the military image and the speeches of power lies another Kaliningrad, one that never appears in parades or on state television. A city where the European accent sounds more natural than Russian, where the architecture looks more like Berlin than Moscow, and where the sense of belonging is slowly drifting away from the Kremlin. Kaliningrad is the westernmost piece of Russia, but also the most disconnected from it. Everyday life in the enclave has always followed its own rhythm. Before the war, it was common to see families crossing the border to shop in Poland, young people studying in Lithuania, and small local businesses selling European goods at markets and fairs. The streets are lined with restored Prussian-style buildings, cafes with bilingual menus, and squares where Russian culture shares space with German traditions. People here have long been used to looking westward rather than toward Moscow. But that bridge to Europe began to crumble in 2022. When the war in Ukraine began, the economic shock hit Kaliningrad like a silent wave. Tourism, once one of the region's main sources of income, simply vanished. Hotels emptied out, flights were cancelled, and sanctions cut off the flow of essential goods from the continent. Within months, prices skyrocketed, and the feeling of abandonment grew. Without the gloss of propaganda, what remained was the harsh reality of isolation. The same government that claimed to protect Kaliningrad was now leaving it to fend for itself. Local trade collapsed, small businesses shut down, and unemployment surged. An unofficial survey conducted by a group of independent regional journalists revealed a figure the Kremlin tries to hide. 72.1% of respondents said they believe Kaliningrad should seek greater autonomy, or even independence, from the Russian Federation. A number that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago, but one that now reflects a growing sense of disconnection and distrust toward Moscow. And this divide isn't just cultural or political, it's also physical. The Baltic countries have already announced that by the end of 2025, they will completely disconnect from the Russian power grid and integrate into the European system. In practice, that will leave Kaliningrad off the continental energy map. The enclave will become dependent on maritime routes to receive electricity and fuel, routes that are vulnerable and could be blocked in times of crisis or conflict. What was once a geographical advantage, an outpost in the heart of Europe, is turning into total strategic isolation. The Kremlin knows it. Behind all the talk of energy self-sufficiency, there's urgency and improvisation. Local power plants have been hastily reactivated, emergency supply lines are being tested, and naval convoys have begun transporting more fuel to the enclave. It's a desperate attempt to keep the lights on, both literally and politically. Meanwhile, inside Kaliningrad, the feeling is growing that the future might lie beyond the border. Young people discuss working in Europe, business owners look for ways to trade indirectly with Poland, and more families are beginning to question what it really means to be Russian in a territory surrounded by Europe on all sides, and forgotten by their own country. Kaliningrad was born from an expanding empire, but today it seems to embody an empire in decline. A territory Putin calls a strategic jewel, but that its own residents now see as a geopolitical prison. And it's in that contrast, between the rhetoric of strength and the reality of abandonment, that the myth of Russian invincibility begins to completely unravel. Kaliningrad has always been portrayed by Moscow as proof of Russian strength, a bastion of power in the heart of Europe, shielded by missiles, defenses, and grand speeches. But in practice, it has become the clearest reflection of the weaknesses within Putin's own regime. What the Kremlin calls resistance is, in reality, the symptom of an empire sustained more by rhetoric than by reality. Lavrov's aggressive statements, the accusations of a hybrid war, and the constant effort to paint the West as the enemy don't reveal confidence, they reveal fear. The military vulnerability of Kaliningrad, now surrounded by NATO and isolated by Moscow's own decisions, exposes a truth the Kremlin is desperate to hide. Russia has lost control over what it once considered its most strategic fortress. While Putin speaks of expansion, the very territory meant to symbolize his strength is quietly falling apart. Trade has collapsed, the population is drifting away from Moscow, and the growing energy isolation threatens to turn Kaliningrad into a trapped archipelago, a political and military island adrift in the heart of Europe. Every move Putin made to consolidate power has produced the opposite effect. The invasion of Ukraine, the threats against NATO, the endless talk of greatness, all of it has only accelerated the encirclement, the economic collapse, and the discontent festering within Russia's own borders. Kaliningrad, the so-called strategic asset, has become a stark reminder that even the loudest empires collapse in silence. Behind the smoke of propaganda, the truth is simple. Putin's house of cards is shaking, and what he once believed to be his secret weapon may, in the end, become the spark that ignites his own downfall. If you want to understand just how far Ukraine can go in this new phase of the war, don't leave the channel. What comes next shows the moment the Kremlin thought the night would be quiet and woke up to Moscow in flames. In our next video, you'll meet the Flamingo, the Ukrainian cruise missile capable of flying over 3,000 kilometers and striking the heart of Russia before any radar can detect it. Click the card on your screen now and see how this new weapon changed the rules of the game. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to do it now and follow every move in this war that's redefining military power around the world.